Corruption has become so endemic in our society that we increasingly speak of it as if though it's become of pandemic proportions. Join us this week as we look at corruption, the cancer of society. Workers' World starts now.
From England to Poland, every step across the ocean, the ruling classes, them is in a mess. Oh yes, the capitalist system a regress, but the Soviet system now progress.
Welcome to our weekly Workers' World Labour Show. I'm your host, Shirik Trubadi. Thank you once again for having joined us. It's an absolute pleasure having you along with us, even though we talk about a very difficult subject today, it being that South Africa has been beset with corruption for several decades. This has impacted severely on public life, governance and social services, especially of poor working class people. The mainstream media has almost exclusively focused on highlighting corruption by the ANC government leaders, downplaying the role of business and its extensive corruption, including being on the other side of this government corruption. In today's show, we highlight the corruption by big business in South Africa and its impact on society. But first, let's go to the insert prepared for us by the Workers' World Media Productions editorial team.
The various ways in which corruption manifests in the country would be in private and also in the public sector. But even in the public sector, there is always an involvement of the private sector in that particular corruption. If you look at all types of corruption, it would not be a public official doing corruption with another public official or a public company. It would be a public official being corrupted and having to give off some certain contracts to a private company.
We have laws and keep developing and sharpening those laws that should prevent illicit financial flows out of our country. But more importantly, the more forward-looking part of this whole question is about setting up a sovereign wealth fund.
So corporate corruption is very, very big in South Africa. We have different forms of corporate corruption. So if you look at multinational companies or big business within the mining sector, for example, corporate corruption there takes the form of kind of undue influence, paying bribes to government to push through policies in their favor, pay workers lower wages to get away with bad working conditions. These are like impacts that directly affect on workers' conditions.
Corruption is the worst cancer in our society, especially from an African perspective, because it affects the poorest. The resources that are meant to be empowering our people, empowering the community, they go to one sort of source, which it becomes overly selfish.
I believe that South Africa would be better if the people who are in power were forced to use public services.
There's obviously also job scarcity, where you'd find probably companies will hire one person to do like 5 different jobs instead of actually getting 5 people. So then the rest of us then don't get jobs and we become unemployed.
So one of the things about mining in general is that by nature it's generally export-based, trade-based. It involves the movement of goods from one country to another. It's also dominated by large multinational corporations across the world. The largest companies will be multinational corporations. And this opens up quite a few avenues for profit shifting. It opens up the ability of companies to maybe falsely declare the amount of goods that they're exporting, the value of minerals that they're exporting. And it also allows these large companies to take advantage of the fact that they already have structures across borders and they have an immense amount of wealth. So they can easily set up different branches in tax havens and jurisdictions around the world.
If you think about some of the evidence coming out of the Zondo Commission about how our banking sector failed to exercise due diligence in order to say who are these individuals who are opening up bank accounts to gather the proceeds of illicit activity to then siphon this money outside of South Africa's borders. So banks have got a responsibility to do something called know who your customer is. So they're supposed to, at the point at which somebody opens a bank account, to say, who is this person and are they what would be called politically exposed? So do they sort of present some type of risk which should cause a bank to then raise a flag to say, is this a suspicious transaction? What we also see in South Africa, but also globally, is that you've got other actors such as lawyers and accountants who are very much part of this network of enabling these types of corruption risks or illicit financial flows.
Look, I think there's elements within government that are trying, but it's not enough. So part of what, and I think that state capture really kind of is an example of the wide range in ways of which corruption manifests and takes place. Number one, it's really the question of protection of whistleblowers, and we've seen whistleblowers being murdered. We've seen whistleblowers being kind of losing their jobs when raising questions. So the protection of whistleblowers is one thing that I think government really can do strongly. Secondly, they need to kind of increase and put more resources into, for example, SARS and other departments that really are trying to say, to track and do the kind of following the money trail, and doing the investigations. But also I think that we do need to act stronger on both individuals and companies engaged in illicit financial flows.
So when these companies shift profits, it means that they are removing money first away from being taxed, which would have contributed to provision of public services and goods. But at the same time, they're also shifting money which could have been factored into wage negotiations. And workers who currently are earning meager wages, we're having 75% of the working force in the country earning less than 5,800. That means you are depriving this 75% of the workforce in the country from claiming their share in those spoils which would have been made by that particular company. So in this instance, you are widening the gap of income inequality, but at the same time, because inequality and poverty and even unemployment go together, you are also worsening the conditions of poverty in the country.
All right, so there we have it. Corruption, indeed, a massive problem in our society. Of course, we can take this back to even the apartheid years and how that to begin was a corrupt system in and of itself. But post-1994, it's become a feature of our democratic society, and particularly a tango between business and the government. I have a panel of guests that's going to be joining me for this discussion. We have Abida Adams, the Provincial Secretary of Kibuza, Etienne Flok, the National Industrial Policy Officer at SACTU, and Malusi Nkala, the Senior Researcher at Corruption Watch. A very good day to you guys. Thank you so very much for having joined us. I want to start off with Malusi from Corruption Watch to describe for us, an overview. Give us an overview of corruption in this country and where I suppose it is most prevalent. Malusi?
Good morning, and thank you for having us, and greetings to the viewers as well. I mean, it's quite mammoth and difficult to give an overview of corruption as it is in this country, because wherever we look, we find incidents of corruption, the public sector, the private sector, and the two often collaborate as well in how they organize themselves to steal from the population, from government coffers, as it were. And, I would say, in fact, the history of corruption in South Africa does not only precede the 94 era, but it goes far back as, the 1652 arrival of the Dutch East Company, in which, there were many dealings at that particular time that were quite rife with fraud malfeasance and corruption in terms of how that business, how that empire did its affairs when it reached the Cape. So, but when we have to fast forward it to present day South Africa, what we find that, there are issues relating to price fixing. There are issues relating to tenders that are being bidded for by certain companies, be it at local government level, be it at provincial level, and how it ultimately plays out is that often you find that there's a small group of businesses that are often given tender opportunities by government. And often what that leads to is that people are not given the service delivery that they so deserve. Hence, we find that our infrastructure, roads, for example, are in such a bad state. Hence, we find at times, the provision of maintenance services is not something that we should now expect, from our government. So there's an actual relationship between those who are working in government and those who are outside government, and it's as far as the president's office and all the way down to municipal managers.
And I want to pick up on. I don't want to lose that point, Malusi. I just want to pick up on there quickly with Abida. One of the challenges often is that corruption is painted as a government problem. That they are the incentivizers behind the corruption and the doers of the corruption. How accurate is that description, Abida?
Sorry, I was speaking without unmuting. Thanks, Tashrik. I think corruption is not just limited to government. Not I think, we know that corruption is not just limited to government. It permeates every part of our society, where we live, how I get a house, even how I get an ID. I mean, it's from the simplest form or to one's child getting into a school of your choice. There's corruption everywhere, and I think that we've become extremely cynical about it. But I think for us as a trade union, what is important is that capitalism breeds corruption. It enables corruption. So I think that we need to zoom in on that, because that is important, because in this class society, capitalism is an enabler of corruption. Yeah. And it's really for us to think that it's only limited to Africa or only to the third world. That is not correct. I mean, in the first world, we know this is the cost of doing business.
Yeah, in fact, I think that's pretty much even a racist view to suggest that it's only an African or black person thing. I want to pick up on the very important point that you raised about it being the system that we need to address, and I'll get into that and more after the break. Do stay with us. Right, we're talking about corruption, just how endemic in our society it has become, but it's a global problem, as we've discussed in our first segment, and how entrenched it has become, and sometimes even the racist overtones in how it is often described. But Etienne, I'd like to welcome you very quickly to the discussion and talk about and pick up on what Abida had to say before the break, that we need to arrest the system, and in this instance, the system is capitalism. And so how would you define, I suppose, the extent of corruption and how entrenched it is with the system that we do have?
Tashrik, what happened with both Malusi's and Abida's input was a very good summary of the extensiveness of it, the fact that, it's endemic. Estimates are that roughly around 500 billion to 1 trillion rand worth of corruption we're seeing in South Africa per year. Of that, about maybe 100 billion or so is in illicit financial flows, maybe another 100 billion or so in illicit trade. So there's no doubt that it's in every single corner of our society, and there's no doubt that nobody is excluded from it. No group, no race, no actor, no stakeholder is excluded from it. So we're seeing it all over. What is especially crucial, and I think Comrade Abida raises this, is that it's while it may be confined to corruption between, say, government and corporates, it has an impact on the working class. It has an impact on workers, on working class communities, on jobs, on industry, etc. And so we shouldn't see it as something that's far removed from workers and from our daily lives. the impact that the different types of corruption has is felt by workers and by working class communities.
And so who then are the victims of it all, Abida, just to pick up on that, the point there about how endemic it has become in society, but is corruption inherently a power struggle of the haves against the have-nots, or is it just the tone and the conversation of the haves in being able to, solicit and facilitate benefit that is to them? How would you describe whether inherently there is an element of power in the relationship with corruption?
I mean, I think there's definitely an element of power in the relationship of corruption. If you look at what's currently happening, I think at the Guardian's Fund at the Department of Justice, I just listened to the news yesterday morning that it was only the low-level staffers who's now actually been arrested. And although, I mean, the trade union, I think it's Nihau, who's continuously saying, look, the senior management they've not arrested any one of them. But the representative from the Department of Justice is insistent that the investigations is ongoing. Similarly with the Thabo Bester escape from the prison. Even now, I think there's something like 12 people arrested, but it's only low-level people, not the ones who controls. And we know that corruption happens because it's about power and it's about allowing who benefits from what, right? But I think what is fundamental about corruption, and this is what Comrade Etienne has said, at who pays for corruption? It's the poor and the working class. I mean, if you look, for example, I think they said something like 500 billion was lost due to corruption at Transnet and Eskom. We are paying. Our members are paying. There aren't reliable rail networks. We are paying because, I mean, how much is electricity included? We are paying for that corruption. So I think what we also need to look at is who carries the cost. They are the beneficiaries, which is not the poor and the working class, right? Maybe if you look at the different levels, there might be on a small scale, maybe at the Department of Home Affairs, when you bribe an official not to stand in a queue, but that is like maybe a 50 rand or a Coke and a packet of chips. Yeah. But if we look at large scale corruption, we are paying for it. The workers and the poor and the working class are paying, but the beneficiaries are sitting on top. For example, we are no longer even having the question that why are we paying so much for electricity? This load shedding doesn't come out of nothing. It is an effect and a manifestation and a cause of corruption. Why are we now, as the consumer, forced to pay for something that we didn't cause? So there's always going to be a loser in corruption, and it's always going to be the poor and the working class, unfortunately.
And I think you raise an important point because even at the Eskom example, we had European companies building Kasuli and Madupe. You had Glencore and others that had facilitated bribes in order for them to get contracts. And of course, when workers do go and ask for wage increases, then oftentimes we're told there isn't quite money because of money having lost to corruption. And it is perhaps that, Malusi, that I want to pick up on is there a way to begin to wrestle corruption, and where do we begin to do so?
Where do we begin to curb corruption? We need to have dedicated leaders, people with integrity. Unfortunately, in the South African context, we don't have that. The people who are rulers of this country, because we can't necessarily call them governors of this country, are people who are intrinsically just corrupt in their nature and the way that they're doing things. But beyond that, I think given that South Africa does have legislation, rules, regulations, and policies to actually deal with corruption, we see it in, for example, in PRECA, and as well as the Organized Crimes Act, and various other pieces of legislations that, it's not by design that we're having this problem, but it's because we're not holding those who are in power accountable. There's no way, for example, that, Fikile Mbalula, for example, finds himself time and again in scandals of corruption, but yet he's being awarded with either ministerial positions or secretary general positions. What it tells you is that clearly then there's no way of holding people accountable. It's just based on who do you know, and which side of history do you find yourself at the time when you're making a lot of noise? So it's up to us as the populace then to make those decisions to say, seeing that this is how you're behaving, and we know what the rules are, and we know what we want, what is our integrity in this process? And our integrity should be based on holding those who are in power accountable.
Is that, though, achievable, Etienne? Trying to, I suppose, facilitate a societal degree of morals and values that doesn't give rise to corruption. And given what Abida highlighted a bit earlier, that for as long as capitalism is the feature of our system, that sounds to be a very difficult feat to achieve.
Absolutely, and we spoke about the power involved. But I think what we need to do is recognize that often where corruption has been exposed, it's because of very brave people on the ground. And it may be that there are whistleblowers in Eskom or Transnet who's done it. Comrade Abida raised the issue of the Nahau, who has raised the problems around the Guardians Fund. VBS, the VBS bank matter came to a head and was exposed because of some shop stewards who raised this. So whistleblowing is extremely important and can help us to do that. Importantly, Tashriq, what we're also seeing is new legislation in the pipeline that will help us with this. For instance, there's a new companies amendment bill and a crucial piece of legislation that should be before Parliament very shortly, which for the first time will reveal beneficial ownership. And what that is who are the real owners behind a company? Who are the real beneficiaries of a trust? In other words, a company is not just owned by a trust or owned by another company, but who are the actual people behind it who will get the money involved? This company's amendment bill we also like because for the first time it will make a lot of company information public. It will be available to workers, to journalists, and so on, and help us to expose corruption. So these are the kind of things that are needed. It's true that we need legislation, but we also need to ensure that there's a path for whistleblowers to be involved. And ultimately, we need the citizens of the country to make their own commitment to not being involved in corruption, to not paying the small bribes here and there, but themselves as well being ethic and trying to build this corruption-free society.
But just quickly on that point before I go to a break, Etienne, does legislation actually work in disincentivizing corrupt activities?
So we believe the most crucial thing is transparency. If you are, for instance, the company's amendment bill, or currently there's a new bill around public procurement that's before Parliament. We as unions are pushing very hard to make sure that there's online procurement in a transparent portal so that everybody can see who receives the tenders, what are they charging for those tenders, what kind of products are they supplying. That doesn't mean we're not going to see corruption, but it does mean
I'm gonna have to just pause it there very quickly, and I want to come back to this point after the break. Why is it that only we know of some names and not the others? We'll jump into that after the break. Do stay with us. We're talking about corruption. It's often a one-sided story. It is Africans painted as being deeply corrupt. It is government painted as deeply corrupt. But it takes two to tango. But there's also layers in how we understand it all. And I want to just pick up on this very quickly, Abida, that in this country we've heard for quite a number of years a deeply corrupted president with deeply corrupted friends. And the reality is that oftentimes, for instance, when these stories had made it into the discourse, it was led by mainstream media that clearly appears to have driven a particular agenda. It appears who the levers of power it is that may be involved in the corruption that oftentimes get, I suppose, demonized for being completely corrupt. But we forget about, of course, private industry, private business, and more so, even those that are currently, I suppose, in government and in power, that doesn't receive the same level of scrutiny. Why does it appear that dealing and highlighting and exposing corruption appears to be subjective?
Thank you, Tashriq. I actually wanted to say that I think it's linked also to what Malusi has said, you know, that, I mean, if you look in a South African context, we've got so much laws and so many different units to deal and address corruption. But by and large, even if you look in the media, our corruption, not that the government and ministers and that whoever who's in political power is not corrupt, but we forget business and private individuals and industry. For example, I mean, if we look at Marcus Jooste, if we look at what happened at Saru with the past CEO, I mean, I think it was Stellenbosch, Rugby, or whatever. So there is corruption everywhere. But I think what is interesting is, and also, you know, for me, what I find, I think that we've also become very cynical in the South African society, because we know that we actually don't need all these different commission and a new commission and a new act and a new thing. Because I will come back to my point to say that as long as we have capitalism, we're going to have corruption. And the idea that corruption only happens in government, I always ask myself, why do we not get more exposure that what is happening in the business world and in private industry? I mean, as a trade unionist, also we see a lot of what is happening when our members come and talk to us, but it's very difficult for them to deal with it. But it's not just even limited to for example, just the private sector. Even trade unions, we've got trade unions under administration. We've got NGOs also. So really in our society, because I think that it is just that capitalism allows and it breeds. Because it's really that thing that I see that government is doing it and they're getting away with it, that it's happening everywhere in our society. So really one should really say that, and corruption didn't start when the ANC government took over in 1994. For example, if we look, for example, in the Western Cape and in the city of Cape Town, we say, oh no, there is no corruption here, or it's not at the scale where it is nationally. I so firmly believe that, especially in the city of Cape Town and in the Western Cape government, that they have just perfected the art of it. It doesn't mean that it's not there, because if you speak to workers on the ground and the poor and the working class communities, they can see the elements of corruption. They can see it, for example, if you go to communities of Bishop Lavis, who is getting the contracts, for example, to build the houses, to repair our roads and all these kind of things, and why some of the housing projects, for example, in the city of Cape Town is delayed. It's because of corruption, but it's also because of the complicitness of the councillors who are, for example, in the city of Cape Town, who are majority DA councillors. So corruption is everywhere. I don't even think that any political party is exempt from it. It's just that some political parties, unfortunately, their corruption is more exposed. But for me, maybe I'm cynical or not, but I think that it is just there. For example, I just heard yesterday that the Minister of Small Business, they said all these different instruments for small businesses to survive, they're going to consolidate it into one. And the first thought that I thought of was, I wonder who's going to benefit and be corrupt there again, because that is what's going to happen. Small business is not going to be assisted. Our economy is not going to be revived. But I think the idea that we say that it is because corruption, yes, corruption contributes to job losses. It contributes to all of those things. But I think if we look at really what is the root cause of corruption, I think that is important. And that is why I think, despite us having so much legislation, Malusi and Etienne, but because of the kind of system that we have, we will always have levels of corruption. And it's just now that it's just so endemic that it's almost like it's become normalized. But I do think that one also needs to focus on is the racialized way how we look at corruption, because I don't think there's the same level of because Marcus Jooste is pretty much living a very
comfortable life,
comfortable life, and there's no focus on him. And I think there should be the same focus on him that we, for example, put on the Guptas and that we put on Jay-Z, because they are equally corrupt and they are both contributing to us sitting with a situation where the poor and the working class is paying for their corruption.
Why, Etienne, do you think this is the case, that there is the skewed focus on who are the drivers of corruption, the actors, the engineers of this corruption?
Part of the simple thing is that often the corporates don't have to go and report to, for instance, Parliament in the way that the government agencies do have to, where some of this may come out. It's often that the focus is more on the idea that it's a government induced operation from the media side. But what is very clear, it's not the case. And I wanted to give you a very important example from our industry. in our industry, an enormous amount of clothing and textile goods are being imported into the country by private actors, from private actors in other countries, but those goods are fraudulently brought into the country to avoid import duties and to avoid taxes. Now, how that is done is in different ways, and it might be that a garment is under-invoiced, it might be smuggled, might be brought in through other borders. But ultimately, this is only purely between private sector actors. And what it does, it means the government doesn't collect the money that it should be collecting, and it can't deliver the services. But also importantly, it undermines local jobs, it undermines local industry. So not just is that corruption about the money that's not being collected, but it's also about how it means as a country we can't grow, we can't increase jobs, and we can't deal with poverty.
And I think the relationship between that poverty and corruption is quite clear. And Malusi, the understanding of how, again, earlier I was asking a question about how to wrestle this and whether it's to dump capitalism, those seems to be a very far and wide-ranging objectives to certainly meet. But from your perspective and some of the research that has been done, is there anywhere in the world where corruption has lessened? And if so, what did they do?
I'm not aware of a situation where, I mean, what the CPI, which is the Corruption Perceptions Index, tells us, basically it's about how certain key institutions, global institutions, perceive countries to be corrupt, right? And it basically from 0 to 100, and it also ranks these countries. And what we find that in countries where the perception of corruption is the lowest, is that they have strong instruments in place, strong accountability, and there's no this dilly-dallying that you find in other countries such as ourselves, where, for example, there would be a discussion for 4 to 6 years to figure out whether indeed corruption happened or not. And quite often, the accountability goes as far as to say that people have to immediately step down when there are allegations pointed at people. So we don't see the kind of circus that we've been subjected to, for example, when it got to Phala in Parliament, where that delay tactics being used.
Yeah.
So,
Malusi, you raise an important point that I want to pick up on, and that is the level of accountability. Do we go the Chinese route where we are told you can lose your limb or even your life, or do we say the most basic level of accountability is for a government official to step down? We'll pick up on that after the break. Do stay with us. We're talking about corruption and extensive conversation thus far about how skewed the conversation is, how one-sided it often is described, how perhaps racist it can be described as well. But I think what we're now at is the point of accountability. How do we begin to wrestle it? So there's an effort through legislation, and legislation can prove to mitigate how rife corruption can become. That's what we've been discussing. But more so when there are people with their fingers in the pie that it's not supposed to be, how do you hold those people to accountable, be it in government or be it through private actors like big business? And I want to pick up on this to start off again with you, Abida. The reality is we had a commission of inquiry in this country that tried to facilitate a conversation about the extent of what we perceive to have been corrupt relationships with the benefit of individuals and private companies from state contracts, etc. It hasn't really taken us anywhere. We've heard about Bosasa, we've heard about what happened with Marcus Jooste and others. We've heard extensively about the role of the Guptas and their businesses in purchasing mines, for instance, to supply coal to Eskom and so on and so forth. We've heard about how a former Minister of Home Affairs had facilitated a deal to allow private entities to move into a state-owned airport, for instance. These are all very much part of our lexicon in how we've come to understand corruption in this country. Do you believe that we have established sufficient mechanisms of accountability in trying to wrestle this issue of corruption in our society?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think it's just a very good example at the moment in terms of accountability. If you know the whole fiasco around the Section 185 Commission and the allegations being made against, I mean, I think 3 of the ANC members. I just heard very recently that I think that the ANC had an opportunity then to show that they really genuinely want to deal with the issue of corruption, even if those individuals were not guilty. As a precautionary measure, instead of the ANC saying to Gianti and, to say, actually, maybe you should stand down from chairing that committee, they came out defending their members, simply saying there is no evidence, this is just allegation. But the fact that there's now a criminal investigation, I think that if the ANC government wants to show us that they are really want to deal with the issue of corruption in all its forms and manifestations, they should just be leading, because society takes the lead, unfortunately, from what government is doing. So the level of accountability, I mean, if you look also don't have all the information, but if you look at what Justice Zonda was saying, and in terms of how many people in the ANC were implicated, but instead those guys, it's almost like they looked as if they were rewarded because they are still in government position and some kind of got promotion in terms of their positions in terms of cabinet. So we do have that, but I think, Tashriq, the unfortunate problem for us and the challenge for us is that the media only expose what happens in government. So we don't have enough information what is happening in industry and in the business world. And I can tell you that it's probably worse or at the same levels. But I mean, there we talk about sometimes, it's kind of acceptable because you call it the cost of doing business and that, and it might not be the exchange or of money, but it manifests in other forms. You get free trips to go to Disneyland, and you get holidays here and there and all these kind of things, and I organize a bursary for your daughter, etc., etc. And I think really that for me, I'm particularly interested in the role of the media, because I don't think that the media is playing the role that they should play. Because really, the same way that they are exposing government corruption, we should be doing that also what is happening in industry, in the private sector, because it again comes back to who's paying the cost. And that is us, it is the poor, and it is the working class. That is why it's important for us, yes, as much as I'm cynical about all the laws and the systems and the SIUs and all this, we need to have these systems. We need to have it work. But I mean, I don't understand how we can deal with the issue of corruption in the South African society when we are subjected with austerity, where government is not releasing funds. I mean, for example, to employ civil servants to do these things. So there's a lot of elements to the issue of around corruption. But I think also that we need to have more. We also need to, for example, have what you would call civil society to lead by example in terms of, for example, if you look at what are the salaries being paid to civil society and in the development sector and in the NGO sector, how are those salaries derived, who are their donors, etc., etc. So there needs to be a whole change in terms of how we look at it.
Yeah.
Because if we
I
want
want to pick up on that quickly with Malusi, the levels of accountability and changing the tone and the way in which we're having the conversation. Do you think there's merit to that argument, Malusi?
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with Abida about that. There is merit to how we position ourselves as ordinary people in society, as NGOs. And then, of course, but the problem then always becomes that, it's government that usually sets the tone. And it's government that illustrates to us what accountability looks like. At the moment, it simply just looks like the little person's always being bullied. Abida mentioned examples, and Etienne also examples about what's happening with the Thabo Bester case and various other cases where you have the ordinary public servants who are the ones who are being punished, whereas top officials are not. For example, in the Western Cape, when you look at industry in the Western Cape, like the farming industry, there's a lot of corruption happening there. When you look at what government tried to do with the farmer worker equity schemes, billions of rands were lost And, no one, absolutely not a single company, not a single person, not a single official has been held accountable. And conveniently, that is the type of story that's being swept under the carpet by media. So it's up to us as well as NGOs to keep on exposing these kind of stories, which is something that we will be doing as Corruption Watch, and to actually rely on the testimony of whistleblowers and the ordinary men and women on the street to actually carry this forward, this mission forward. But I must also just stress that, it's an ideal that we have a corrupt-free society, but it will never truly manifest. With the true test of how we want corruption to be is that we want the least amount of corruption happening in society, and that's because we can't really quantify how corruption looks like. But at this point in time, the story of South Africa is quite gloomy.
Yeah.
Tashriq, may I add on the issue of accountability?
Very quickly, Etienne.
I think one of the things that we're not addressing is the role of auditors. So the auditors have got a role to go through the finances of a company, identify where there may be corruption, and either that they're not doing their job properly, or they have such close relationships with the corporates that they don't do it. And as a result, whether it's with Steinhoff or whether it's with Tongaat, Hewlett, whatever, those auditors are not doing their jobs. We're not seeing the results. We're not picking up the corruption early enough. And so we need to find ways, including, for instance, the mandatory rotation of auditors, so that companies and auditors don't get too tight and don't develop a relationship that's incestuous. There needs to be independent auditors that show us what's happening in companies, and that can also help to expose it in the media.
And that's a very crucial point, because those auditors, in fact, had also come into sharp focus at the Zondo Commission of Inquiry, how some of them had willfully looked the other way or had covered up corruption, deep entrenched corruption within private businesses. Once we do return, it's clearly a cancer. How do we begin to tackle the cancer? After the break, we establish an answer to that question. Do stay with us.
We are an online news website that brings you news, analysis, and perspectives from working class, marginalized communities and labor.
Imali esiyikhiphayo ku-government kungcono kakhulu than ukuhlukunyezwa lokhu esikuhlukunyezwa ngamapolisa.
Elicha is published by Workers World Media Productions and is a bilingual website as we cover labor, health, education, and local government issues in English and isiXhosa.
Le corolla asiya noba xa sifika emzini siyayizisa okanye mhlawumbi siyayithatha.
To get community, national, and international news from Elicha, please subscribe to our website and download our mobile app.
Corruption is indeed endemic, as we've established in our conversation thus far. But how do we begin to eradicate it? Of course, there are very broad objectives, and while that is crucial, there are very immediate efforts in very different sectors that we need to begin to address this problem of corruption and just how endemic it has become. Etienne, I want to just pick up with you very quickly on the point of, you raised before the break, the auditors and how they have played a crucial role in this. We've seen, in the last 10, 15 years, the role of how senior police officers and even up to a national commissioner had been corrupted, how there were wives of ministers that were facilitating drops of drugs in other countries and so on, that we're looking at the people that we entrust, that there must be some level of accountability, some level of being righteous in the executing of their duties, that they don't appear to do so. Why do you think the cancer of corruption has been able to get hold of them in the way that it has, that even the police service or somebody that's an auditor that's meant to audit the books of a company would be able to look the other way or skew the books in a way to avoid the publication of wrongdoing? Why do you think that is the case?
It's such a difficult question, Tashriq. I mean, absolutely spot on, but such a difficult question, because I think if we knew the exact answer and the motivations of people, we'd be able to address it. But for us, inequality plays a big role, and we should not underestimate inequality. In the fact that people see some people driving around in Porsches when when perhaps they work a full day and struggle to survive. The fact that some rich people see other people who are much richer and want to be like that, sees them involved in corrupt activities. For us, you spoke about the involvement of the police and so on, and I want to link it with a point that Abida made, that austerity means that we're paying less or we're allocating less and less money for public services. And what that means is our regulators are not properly resourced, our enforcement agencies are not properly resourced. And if we don't make sure that the regulators at overseas companies or the police and others that help to deal with corruption and the NPA are properly resourced, then we're not going to be able to fight it. So there's no doubt that austerity is playing a role to undermine our ability to erode or eradicate corruption.
And it makes it very difficult, I suppose, Malusi, when the person at the top of government is facing allegations of having, for instance, shoved millions of foreign currency into furniture, and there was a parliamentary inquiry that said he has a case to answer for. Politically, that was defeated by the ANC, and at the moment we are left without any particular answers. And I don't want to particularly focus on Pala Pala, but the issue here is that appears to be very true: the fish rots from the head.
Yeah, definitely the fish rots from the head, and this feeds into the trust that ordinary people have in government institutions, right? Etienne correctly mentions about austerity, what it leads to, but then at the same time, when people hear that, oh, my president has actual cash stashed in his furniture, then they think to themselves, well, how much of a shortage do we really have? I'm here standing at a Home Affairs queue, trying to get an ID, and I'm told there's not enough money to employ more officials that can assist me. I'm at a clinic, I'm trying to get a simple thing as a Panado or even ARVs, but they're unavailable because there's not enough money. Then it's bound to make people very angry. It's bound to make people not trust officials. And we then have to then ask the question, who's there to lead society? Who's there to set the right tone? And at the moment, our officials are not those people. Our people in government, our people in parliament, the executive in particular, are not doing that. And the situation will basically just become worse, because that's what's essentially it's predicted about capitalism, that eventually it eats itself.
Yeah. And I think that is truly what we are beset with at the moment. Abida, it's a complicated conversation to have about how we convince members of the public to not buy the traffic officer a cool drink and give him a 20 rand when they are stopped, when we have a head of state and a government and big business like Marcus Jooste. I believe an arrest warrant was issued for him because he refuses to be held accountable, by some German authorities. That you have big levers of power here that's involved in corruption, which makes the ordinary man on the street, the shop steward at the workplace, the union, or even civil society, to be less, I suppose, sensitive to doing the right thing.
Absolutely, Tashrik. I think even in the Marcus Jooste case, it's actually pensioners who suffering, because there's lots of pension funds who actually went under and lost a lot of money. But I think probably a part that we didn't focus so much on is indeed the protection for the whistleblowers, because we cannot talk about accountability if we do not have systems in place and measures in place that will actually protect whistleblowers. Because I think a lot of the time where people are not coming forth is because they see what has happened with other people. Like, you lose your life, you lose your livelihood, you lose your house, you lose your family, you can lose everything if you decide to come forward and to be principled and to be a whistleblower. And that, I think it's really part of the challenge, because sometimes, especially in workplaces and that, and you wonder why. Everybody sees it, everybody knows about it, but I think people are always thinking, what are the implications of me coming forward? And until we have a process and the systems where we can protect whistleblowers, we are going to have a situation, because you know what happens, especially in an employment relation, where employers would then, because maybe Tashriq is now a whistleblower, we are going to have charges against him, suspend him, dismiss him, and then it takes years sometimes. You might get restitution after 5 or 6 years, but at what cost to you and your family life? And I think that is an important aspect in our South African society, because even us in civil society, besides legislation, I don't think there's sufficient and the necessary support for people who take the brave step to step up as a whistleblower. And that is a conversation we have. I mean, like even in the trade union movement, we are seeing it with some individuals now who's being targeted because they are making that step, either in their trade union or in a federation or with employees, etc., etc. And that is the thing that we really need to focus on. I think it's, if we as a civil society want to help and assist the issue around accountability, we need to have better measures and systems in place to assist and support whistleblowers, because sometimes people doing it at the risk of their lives and at the risk of their families and their livelihoods.
Just very quickly, Abida, before we wrap up, your thoughts on whether we should be punishing and penalizing those that are found to be guilty of corruption, and in what way?
Absolutely. I think, you know, the asset and forfeiture, that is some ways, but I think also that, you know, a lot of the time that, you know, because it's seen as a kind of a white-collar crime, normally the punishment is really a slap on the wrist. And that is why I think it's increasing, because if you think of the cost, you think, it's not that much, or it's not that. But I think that we need to have harsher punishment, I think, for corruption. But also, I think besides the harsher punishment, is speeding up the process, because, you know, these trials takes years and years and years, and by the end, the person is either too old or we have forgotten and society has forgotten. So there isn't and I think that is part of the problem, because there isn't a situation then where society then ostracizes that individual. So, I mean, in terms of being held accountable, that is a problem.
And I think that is the problem, as you rightfully say, that there isn't a proper mechanisms of accountability that we have in this country at the moment to wrestle corruption. And as long as that continues, I don't think we're going to get anywhere with beginning to deal with the problem in a way that is materially and demonstratively important enough for us to begin to shift the conversation about how endemic corruption has become in this country, but of course a global phenomenon that has nothing to do with race and nothing to do with social status, as well as we've been discussing throughout the course of today's program. I'm going to thank my guests for coming in and coming through for this discussion. Thank you for tuning in, and indeed let's continue to try and strive to a society that we want to live in, a society that indeed is free of corruption. Thank you so very much for tuning in. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.